At around 3 in the morning, the sky over Novorossiysk turned orange. Tracer fire climbed off the water in long, looping arcs. Air defense batteries screamed into the dark. And somewhere below all of it, 4 Russian warships sat exposed at anchor with nowhere to run. This is not a hypothetical. This happened overnight into August 12, 2026, and by the time the sun came up, Russia's last real naval sanctuary on the Black Sea had a hole punched straight through the middle of it. For years, Novorossiysk was supposed to be the safe harbor, the place Russia's navy retreated to after it got beaten out of Sevastopol. And now it isn't safe either. That is the story we're unpacking today, and it goes a lot deeper than one night of explosions. To understand why this strike matters so much, you have to go back to where Russia's Black Sea Fleet actually started this war, and why it doesn't live there anymore. In April 2022, Ukraine sank the Moskva, the flagship cruiser of the entire Black Sea Fleet, using domestically modified anti-ship missiles. That single sinking humiliated the Russian Navy in front of the entire world, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Over the next 2 years, Ukraine kept finding ways to reach Russian ships in Sevastopol, the historic home port of the fleet in occupied Crimea. Drone boats, cruise missiles, sabotage operations on the bridge connecting Crimea to Russia, the pressure never really let up. By late 2023 and through 2024, Russian naval commanders started quietly moving as many vessels as they could out of Sevastopol and eastward, across the Black Sea, to the mainland port of Novorossiysk in Russia's Krasnodar region. The idea was simple. Novorossiysk sits more than 300 kilometers from the front line. It was supposed to be out of range. It was supposed to be the one place Russia's navy could sit still without looking over its shoulder. That assumption started cracking almost as soon as the fleet arrived. Ukraine hit an oil terminal in Novorossiysk back in May of 2025, damaging tanks at a grain facility and injuring several people, according to local governor Veniamin Kondratyev. Then, in November 2025, Ukrainian forces struck one of Russia's largest oil export facilities right there in the same port, triggering a fire and knocking out a launcher from Russia's S-400 air defense system, according to Ukraine's general staff. And back in early March of this year, Ukraine's security service and armed forces hit Russian naval vessels directly inside Novorossiysk's harbor. The trawler, Valentin Pikul, and the anti-submarine ships Yeysk and Kasimov, with 3 Russian sailors killed and 14 wounded, according to Ukrainska Pravda's sourcing at the time. So when people say this week's attack came out of nowhere, that's not quite right. What actually happened is different, and in some ways more unsettling for Moscow. Ukraine had already been testing the door. This time, it kicked it down. But the eastward relocation to Novorossiysk was never just a story about geography. It was also a story about a country with almost no traditional navy, inventing an entirely new way to fight one. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine had lost most of its naval infrastructure and ships years earlier, after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. A conventional ship-to-ship naval war was never realistic for Kiev. So Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, and the Domestic Security Service, the SBU, went in a different direction entirely, building cheap, explosive-laden uncrewed surface vessels designed to do at a few $100,000 apiece what a warship costing hundreds of millions could not always do safely. Get close. According to the Royal United Services Institute, small Ukrainian surface drones first breached Russian harbor defenses at Sevastopol back in October 2022, penetrating deep into the port and even targeting the Black Sea Fleet's flagship at the time, which, notably, was the very same frigate, Admiral Makarov, that Ukraine's general staff now says was damaged again in this week's Novorossiysk strike. That's not a coincidence worth glossing over. It's the same ship, hunted across 2 different ports nearly 4 years apart by 2 completely different generations of Ukrainian drone technology. From there, the naval drone program only accelerated. The GUR's Magura V5 became, in February 2024, the first naval drone in history to sink an enemy warship in active combat, destroying the Tarantul III class missile corvette Ivanovets, and later the Rapucha-class landing ship Cesar Kunikov, according to reporting published by the U.S. Naval Institute. Within roughly the first year after the Magura program went public, those drones alone were credited with destroying 8 Russian warships and damaging 6 more, causing more than $500 million in losses to the Russian fleet, per the same Naval Institute analysis. The SBU's parallel program, the Sea Baby, grew from a smaller harassment weapon into a long-range strike platform capable of covering more than 1,500 kilometers and carrying up to 2,000 kilograms of payload, according to the SBU's own public disclosures in October 2025. Enough range to reach effectively anywhere along Russia's Black Sea coastline from Ukrainian-controlled launch points. Sea Baby drones have also been credited with mining and damaging the underwater supports of the Kerch Bridge, the critical link between Russia and occupied Crimea, in an attack the SBU confirmed this past June. Taken together, independent trackers and Ukrainian officials estimate that naval drones and missiles have sunk or damaged somewhere close to a dozen Russian warships since the start of the full-scale war, and forced the Black Sea Fleet's main operations back to Novorossiysk in the first place, according to a Hess Naval Institute report, cited by Defense News. In other words, the very port Russia fled to in order to escape this exact threat is the port that just got hit by a scaled-up version of the same threat, now flying in on jet power instead of arriving purely by water. That escalation from small harassment drones to a coordinated missile and drone strike package is the real through line of this war at sea, and it's part of why the August 12th operation reads as a turning point rather than a one-off. It's also worth noting that this Ukrainian naval drone technology hasn't stayed confined to the Black Sea. According to Defense News, the U-Force company that manufactures the Magura has begun exporting the design. And in June of this year, American Special Forces used a Ukrainian-built Magura drone to sink a target ship during the Balikatan military exercise off the Philippines, the first operational use of the technology in the Indo-Pacific, with the Pentagon reportedly studying the lessons as it plans for a potential future conflict involving China. A weapon developed out of necessity by a country with almost no navy at the start of this war is now being examined by the U.S. military as a template for an entirely different theater on the other side of the planet. That's the scale of what's actually been building toward this week's strike on Novorossiysk. Here's what we know, verified through multiple name sources, about the night of August 12th. Ukraine's general staff said its defense forces carried out a joint operation striking the Russian naval base at Novorossiysk, describing it as a combined air, sea, and drone assault. President Volodymyr Zelensky called it a unique operation in a statement posted to social media, saying Ukraine used Palianytsia jet-powered strike drones, Neptune cruise missiles, and uncrewed naval systems to hit air defense positions, piers, and port infrastructure. Those aren't vague categories. The Palianytsia is a Ukrainian-built jet-powered munition, effectively a cruise missile with drone-like mass production behind it, developed domestically, specifically, so that Kiev wouldn't need Western sign-off to use it deep inside Russian territory. The Neptune, meanwhile, is the same missile family that sank the Moskva back in 2022. Since upgraded into a longer-range land attack variant, Zelensky has referred to publicly as the Long Neptune, capable of reaching targets up to 1,000 kilometers away. Put those two together with naval drones skimming across the water at wave height, and you get a strike package that's very hard for a fixed air defense position to fully stop, because it's arriving from 3 different directions and 3 different altitudes at once. According to Ukraine's general staff, 4 Russian warships sustained damage of varying degrees in the attack. The vessels named were the frigates Admiral Makarov and Admiral Essen, both Project 11356, Grigorovich-class ships, along with the Project 21631 small missile ship Buyan-M and the Project 22160 patrol vessel Vasily Bykov. That detail about the 2 frigates matters more than it might sound like at first. Admiral Essen and Admiral Makarov are exactly the kind of ships that carry caliber cruise missiles, the weapons Russia has used repeatedly to strike Ukrainian cities from a distance. According to reporting from the Maritime Executive, citing open-source military trackers, this wasn't even the first time Ukraine claimed to have hit these 2 ships. Essen was reportedly struck back in early March, and Makarov just a few days after that. If a warship keeps getting damaged and keeps getting patched up and sent back into rotation, that tells you something about how thin Russia's remaining margin actually is in the Black Sea. There simply aren't unlimited replacement frigates sitting in reserve. Beyond the warships, Ukrainian strikes reportedly hit a 30 N6E radar system tied to an S-300 air defense battery, a mobile firing position at Pier Number 2, an oil depot tunnel entrance at the Shiskarys terminal, and infrastructure spread across Piers 3, 6, and 7, according to reporting compiled by United 24 Media, drawing on statements from Ukraine's security service. The security service itself put out a statement calling Novorossiysk one of the key facilities of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and its main outpost in the Black Sea, and noted correctly that the enemy moved a significant portion of its ships there specifically because Crimea had become too dangerous. In other words, Ukraine's own intelligence services are framing this strike as proof that the relocation strategy Russia adopted years ago has now failed at its second location too. Now let's talk about what this actually cost, because the human toll here is real, and the reporting on it is not entirely consistent, which is worth being upfront about. Krasnodar region, Governor Veniamin Kondratyev, said the area spent the night repelling what he described as a massive drone assault, involving hundreds of drones, hitting not just Novorossiysk, but also Anapa, Gelendzhik, and the Temryuk district. Russia's defense ministry in Moscow claimed its forces shot down more than 500 Ukrainian drones overnight, a figure that, if accurate, would represent one of the largest single-night drone volumes of the entire war, aimed at one region. On casualties, the numbers vary depending on which outlet and which point in the day you're reading. NBC News, citing Governor Kondratyev directly, reported that an 8-year-old child was killed in Novorossiysk, and that a separate person wounded in the Temryuk district later died in hospital, with 12 others wounded in the region. CNBC, in a later report the same day, cited Kondratyev putting the death toll at 3 people, including the 8-year-old, with 24 injured. United 24. Media reported 3 killed and more than 10 injured, with dozens of homes damaged and a state of emergency declared. Those figures don't perfectly line up, and that's worth flagging honestly rather than picking whichever number sounds cleanest. Casualty counts in the first 24 hours of a strike like this are almost always revised as regional officials get fuller damage assessments, and Kondratyev's own numbers shifted over the course of the day. What is consistent across every source is that a child died, that the toll was in the range of a few killed and roughly a dozen to 2 dozen wounded, and that residential buildings, homes, not military sites, took damage from falling drone debris and intercepted munitions, which is a recurring pattern whenever a major air defense engagement happens over a populated Russian city. Here's where the story widens out beyond the port itself, into something with global economic weight. Novorossiysk isn't just a naval base, it's one of Russia's most important commercial export hubs, handling a huge share of the country's grain shipments and a significant slice of its crude oil exports. According to Reuters, a grain terminal at the port was damaged and temporarily suspended operations following the attack. Other reporting, including from the Kyiv Independent and Ukrainian outlet Militarny, which cross-referenced NASA's firm's satellite fire detection system to confirm thermal signatures at the site, indicated the Shishkary's oil terminal and port infrastructure serving the Black Sea Fleet were also among the locations damaged. Open-source analysts tracking the strike, including the group known as Exlanova Plus, reported that berths at Shishkary's, capable of loading large Aframax and Suezmax-class oil tankers, were hit, with satellite imagery reportedly showing burn marks, firefighting foam, and oil slicks in the water near the terminal. It's worth being clear that some of this detail, particularly the specific claim about an Aframax tanker being struck mid-loading and the identification of the NKHP grain terminal by name, comes from open-source intelligence trackers rather than official government statements, so treat that layer of detail as credible but not yet formally confirmed by either government. This isn't the first time Washington has weighed in on Novorossiysk specifically. According to the Kyiv Independent, the U.S. State Department warned Ukraine as far back as November 2025 that further strikes on the Novorossiysk port risked threatening American economic interests, a reference to exactly the kind of Kazakh oil infrastructure tied up in the Caspian Pipeline Consortium mentioned above. That warning didn't stop the strikes that followed later that same month, when Ukraine hit one of Novorossiysk's largest oil export facilities, triggering a fire and damaging an S-400 air defense launcher, according to Ukraine's general staff at the time. So this week's operation sits at the end of a pattern that's been running for close to a year. Washington flags a specific economic red line. Ukraine continues striking military and naval infrastructure at the same port anyway. And this time, according to National Security Journal's reporting, appears to have made a visible effort to route around the one piece of infrastructure, the Caspian pipeline route, that Washington specifically asked it to avoid. That's a notable balancing act for Kyiv to be managing in the middle of an active strike against a heavily defended military target. Why does a damaged grain terminal in southern Russia matter to someone watching this in an entirely different part of the world? Because Novorossiysk exports a genuinely large share of Russian wheat, and Russia is one of the largest wheat exporters on the planet. When 2 major grain terminals at a single port go offline, even temporarily, that ripples into global commodity markets. And multiple outlets covering the story noted that the strike had already begun nudging world wheat prices upward within hours. There's also a quieter, stranger thread running through this. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which carries a substantial share of crude exports from major Kazakh oil fields, fields in which American companies, Chevron and ExxonMobil, hold financial stakes, also runs through the Novorossiysk area. According to reporting from National Security Journal, this pipeline infrastructure appears to have been deliberately spared in the strike, with some reports suggesting Washington, through Vice President J.D. Vance, had specifically asked Kyiv to avoid it. If that detail holds up, it says something important about how carefully calibrated even a strike this aggressive actually was. Ukraine wasn't just hitting everything within reach, it was reportedly threading a needle between crippling Russian naval and oil export capacity, while trying not to detonate a diplomatic argument with Washington over American commercial interests. That's a level of restraint that doesn't usually make it into the "Putin is furious" headlines, but it's arguably one of the most interesting parts of the whole operation. So what has Russia actually said about all this? And here's where we have to be honest about what we don't know yet, rather than inventing a dramatic quote to fill the gap. as of the time this script was written, there had been no direct on-camera public statement from Vladimir Putin himself addressing the Novorossiysk strike specifically. That's not unusual. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has historically been the one to front Russia's initial public response to major Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russian territory, while Putin stays out of the immediate news cycle. When Ukraine's security service hit Russian strategic bomber bases in a coordinated operation back in June of 2025, an attack that reportedly disabled a huge portion of Russia's long-range bomber fleet, Peskov told reporters at the time that the president had simply received information about the incident online and that the matter was under investigation. Putin didn't comment publicly on that one for some time either. What we do have, on the record, is Krasnodar's regional government declaring a state of emergency, and Russia's defense ministry publicly claiming it intercepted the overwhelming majority of the drones involved, a claim that, if you line it up against satellite imagery showing 4 damaged warships and 2 suspended grain terminals, doesn't fully square with the idea that the defense was a clean success. That gap between the official Russian messaging and the visible physical damage is, in itself, one of the more telling parts of this story. Moscow's public posture after major strikes has repeatedly leaned on the phrase that its responses will be systemic in nature, a line Peskov has used almost word for word after previous deep strikes on Russian territory, including one earlier this summer on St. Night, Petersburg. Whether that pattern holds again here with something as symbolically damaging as 4 warships in the Navy's last safe port is something we'll only know in the days ahead. There's a wider military context that makes this strike land harder than it might have a year or two ago. Zelensky, in the same period as the Novorossiysk operation, said Ukrainian intelligence believes Putin is planning an additional rapid mobilization of several 100,000 Russians by the end of the year. He also said Ukrainian intelligence has tracked Russia expanding its production of ballistic missiles and jet-powered attack drones, weapon types that Ukrainian air defense crews have publicly said are among the hardest to intercept. Put that together with a Ukrainian claim, also from Zelensky, that Ukrainian forces have liberated 745 square kilometers of territory in the Oleksandrivka sector since January, and killed close to 10,000 Russian soldiers in that stretch, a figure from Ukraine's own government that has not been independently verified by outside monitors and should be treated as Kiev's official claim rather than a confirmed fact. And you get a picture of a war that is not winding down on the ground, even as it escalates dramatically at sea and in the air. Zelensky also said, in comments reported the same week, that he and Ukraine's allies have a plan to force Putin to stop the war, stating plainly that Putin does not want to stop this war, but he will stop it. That's a bold claim, and right now it remains exactly that. A claim, not a confirmed outcome, and it's worth treating it with the same caution as any other unverified statement from either side of this conflict. It's worth remembering, too, that the Black Sea's role in the global food supply has already broken down once in dramatic fashion during this war. Russia withdrew from the wartime deal that had guaranteed safe passage for Ukrainian grain shipments out of Black Sea ports back in the summer of 2023. And in the aftermath, Russian drones and missiles repeatedly struck Ukrainian port facilities and grain silos, according to reporting at the time. That earlier collapse of the grain corridor sent shockwaves through global wheat and food security markets, particularly across parts of Africa and the Middle East that rely heavily on Black Sea grain. What makes the Novorossiysk strike different is that this time it's Russian grain infrastructure absorbing the disruption instead of Ukrainian infrastructure, a fairly direct reversal of who has been able to threaten the other side's food exports at will for most of this war. There's also a diplomatic layer sitting right on top of all of this. On the same day this strike was making headlines, Russia said it was, in principle, ready to resume peace talks with Ukraine, but attached a new condition to that offer, according to reporting from RBC Ukraine. Neither the exact nature of that condition nor Ukraine's formal response to it had been fully clarified in the immediate aftermath of the Novorossiysk strike. So rather than guess at what Moscow's new precondition actually demands, the honest answer is that this is a developing diplomatic thread running in parallel with the military one, and the two are almost certainly connected. Striking Russia's last Black Sea naval stronghold and disrupting its grain exports the same week Russia signals openness to talks is not a coincidence in the way modern wars are fought. It's leverage on both sides at the same time. Let's step back and look at the strategic picture, because that's really what makes this different from just another overnight drone story. For more than 2 years, Russia's answer to losing Sevastopol was geography. Move the ships east, put 300 kilometers of open water in Russian airspace between the fleet and Ukrainian territory, and assume that distance equals safety. Novorossiysk was Plan B, and for a while it mostly worked, aside from scattered strikes on oil infrastructure. What August 12th demonstrates is that distance alone doesn't buy safety anymore, not against a strike package that mixes long-range jet-powered drones. missiles that can already fly 1,000 kilometers, and naval drones that don't need to fly at all. They just need to reach the water. There's effectively no remaining port on Russia's Black Sea coastline, from Sevastopol in occupied Crimea all the way east to Novorossiysk, that Ukraine has not now demonstrated an ability to reach. That's not propaganda. That's a pattern built up, strike by strike over roughly 4 years, documented independently through satellite imagery, named government statements on both sides, and open source analysts cross-checking the claims against thermal and visual data. For Russia, that leaves an uncomfortable set of choices, and none of them are good. Option 1 is trying to push the fleet even further east, but there really isn't anywhere left to go. The only way out of the Black Sea toward the Caspian is through the narrow Kerch Strait, a choke point Ukraine has already targeted multiple times, including strikes on the Kerch Bridge itself going back to 2023 and 2024, plus the SBU-confirmed Sea Baby mining operation against the bridge's underwater supports, as recently as this past June. That bridge has now been hit at least 3 separate times since the start of the full-scale war, and each time, Russia has had to shut it down for repairs, temporarily cutting off one of the only direct land links between Russia and occupied Crimea. Routing damaged frigates through that same choke point, past a structure Ukraine has proven it can reach underwater as well as from the air, is not a risk-free option for Moscow, no matter how badly it might want to put more distance between its fleet and Ukrainian strike range. Sending damaged, high-value frigates through a strait that's already been hit repeatedly is not an appealing plan. Option 2 is pouring more air defense assets into Novorossiysk itself, layering up S-300 and other systems around the port, but that means defending a location that also happens to be a major civilian city with homes, apartment buildings, and now, repeatedly, dead and wounded residents from intercepted drone debris. A defensive posture that comes with its own political cost inside Russia. Option 3, the one Russian officials have leaned on publicly so far, is downplaying the damage, emphasizing the drones that were shot down rather than the ones that got through, and letting Peskov's familiar language about systemic responses stand in for any specific retaliatory plan. None of those 3 options solves the underlying problem, which is that Ukraine has now shown repeatedly across multiple ports that it can reach deep into Russian territory using weapons it builds itself, without needing permission from Washington or Brussels to pull the trigger. That last point is worth sitting with for a second, because it's arguably the most important structural fact buried inside this story. The Palianytsia and the Neptune are Ukrainian-designed and Ukrainian-manufactured. Ukrborimprom, Ukraine's state defense conglomerate, builds the Palianytsia. The Luch Design Bureau developed the Neptune, the same missile family responsible for sinking the Moskva at the very start of the full-scale invasion. That means every time Ukraine uses these weapons against a target like Novorossiysk, it isn't waiting on a green light from any foreign government, and it isn't burning through a limited stockpile of imported munitions that has to be replenished through a slow diplomatic and logistical pipeline. It's running on domestic production. For Russia, that's a fundamentally different kind of threat than dealing with Western-supplied HIMARS rockets or ATACMS missiles, because there's no foreign policy lever to pull, no ally to pressure into slowing deliveries. The only way to stop it is to stop Ukraine's ability to build and launch the weapons directly, which is exactly why Russian officials keep talking about hitting Ukraine's defense industrial base whenever they respond to strikes like this one. It's also worth putting some numbers around how far this strategy has actually traveled. Novorossiysk sits more than 300 kilometers from the nearest active front line, according to multiple outlets covering the strike, including Euronews. The extended-range long Neptune variant Zelensky announced back in March 2025 is reportedly capable of reaching targets up to 1,000 kilometers away, first used successfully in combat later that same year. That's not a marginal upgrade. That's the difference between a weapon that can harass Russian positions near the border and one that can, in theory, reach deep into Russian territory well beyond the Black Sea coast entirely. Whether Ukraine chooses to use that reach against targets further from the coast in the future is an open question, but the capability itself is no longer theoretical. It's been demonstrated in a live strike against one of Russia's most heavily defended naval assets. It's also worth pointing out how quickly this specific technology cycle has moved. The Sea Baby drone that started out primarily as a Crimean bridge weapon had its range expanded from around 1,000 kilometers to 1,500 kilometers in the space of roughly a year, according to the SBU's own public figures. The long Neptune variant went from announcement to confirmed combat use within the same 12-month window. That pace of iteration, publicly disclosed upgrades landing in the field within months rather than years, is unusual for wartime weapons development, and it's part of why Russian planners have struggled to build a defense that stays ahead of what Ukraine fields next. A fixed air defense battery designed to intercept subsonic cruise missiles at a certain altitude and speed doesn't necessarily adapt well to a jet-powered drone arriving on a different flight profile a few months later. And Novorossiysk's defenders found that out in real time overnight on August 12th. So where does that leave things heading into whatever comes next in this war? Russia is sitting on a navy that has now been pushed out of its second home port in under 2 years, an export hub with 2 grain terminals offline and wheat markets already reacting, and a domestic political situation where a state of emergency has been declared in a major city following a strike that its own defense ministry insists was mostly repelled, even as satellite images show 4 damaged warships sitting in the harbor. Ukraine, meanwhile, is heading into a moment where its own president is talking about a plan with allies to force an end to the war, at the exact same time Moscow is signaling, with a fresh condition attached, that it's open to talks. Whether that's a genuine diplomatic opening or another round of positioning before the next escalation is something nobody outside a very small circle in Moscow, Kiev, and Washington actually knows right now, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Before we wrap up, here's a quick rundown of where this information actually came from and what still needs more confirmation. The core facts, the Palianytsia and Neptune weapons used, the 4 damaged warships, the strike on air defense and port infrastructure, come from Ukraine's general staff and President Zelensky's own public statements, cross-referenced against reporting from the Kiev Independent, Euronews, the Maritime Executive, and United 24 media. Casualty figures come from Krasnodar Governor Veniamin Kondratyev, cited by NBC News and CNBC. Though, as noted, those numbers shifted over the course of the day and should be treated as still developing. The grain terminal suspension is confirmed by Reuters. Details about the specific tanker strike, the NKHP grain terminal identification, and the exact berths hit at Shishkaris come from open-source analysts including Exilinova Plus and Militarny, using satellite and thermal imagery. Credible, but independently sourced rather than officially confirmed by either government. The claim that the Caspian Pipeline Consortium infrastructure was deliberately spared, reportedly at Washington's request, comes from national security journals reporting, and has not been confirmed by an on-record U.S. or Ukrainian government statement, so treat that detail as reported, but not fully verified. And critically, there is no confirmed, on-the-record statement from Vladimir Putin himself about this strike as of this writing. Anything framing his personal reaction beyond the Kremlin's institutional response is speculation, and we've tried to avoid presenting it as fact. What do you think happens next? Does Russia actually come back to the negotiating table with this new condition, or does a strike this damaging to its own naval fleet make Moscow dig in harder instead? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want the next update on how this develops, you know what to do.